Almost every prominent Nazi woman after 1945 told the same story. They'd been apolitical, they'd been kept in the dark, they'd loved a man, not a regime, but one of them, arguably the most decorated of them all, refused to play along. Hanna Reitsch flew Hitler's experimental rocket plane, pitched him on a kamikaze squadron in person, and was one of the last people to see him alive in the bunker beneath Berlin. And until the day she died in 1979, she still wore the Iron Cross with diamonds he had given her, and insisted that the only real guilt Germany should carry was losing the war. She wasn't the opposite of every female Nazi because she was secretly better. She was the opposite because she was the only one who never bothered to pretend. To feel how far the opposite goes, you have to see the mould first. The Nazi regime had a very specific idea of what a German woman was for. The slogan was Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. A woman's highest contribution to the Reich was breeding the next generation of Aryans, keeping a clean home and staying carefully out of politics. The party even handed out medals for it. The Mother's Cross, awarded in bronze, silver, and gold, based on how many children you had produced. 4 children got you bronze, 8 got you gold. That was the official picture, and it shaped how almost every Nazi wife would be remembered after 1945. Lena Heydrich, Magda Goebbels, Margarete Himmler, Emmy Goering, Eva Braun. When they spoke in interrogations or wrote memoirs, the story was almost identical. They had loved their husbands. They had not really known what those husbands were doing. They had been wives, not ideologues. Some ran charity work, some threw dinner parties. None of them, in their own telling, had any meaningful role in the Reich itself. The average female Nazi was a wife or a low-rank functionary, and the moment the regime collapsed, she became a widow, a refugee, or a defendant pleading domestic ignorance. Most of them disappeared into small Munich apartments and quiet pensions, hoping their names would fade. Hanna Reitsch did not fit that mould for a single day. While her contemporaries were being told to have more children for the Führer, she was flying combat aircraft for him. How does a doctor's daughter from Silesia end up there? She was born in 1912 in Hirschberg, a small spa town in what was then Eastern Germany and is now part of Poland. Her father wanted her to study medicine. She started dutifully in the early 1930s and then quietly walked away from it because she had fallen in love with something else entirely. In her own memoir, she described the pull of flight as a deep, insistent homesickness. The feeling she got watching birds and clouds, like she was supposed to be up there with them. She started with gliders, riding silent air currents over the Silesian hills, and she was extraordinary at it almost immediately. By 1932, she was the first German woman to hold a captain's flight license. The records kept piling up: distance, altitude, endurance, until she had passed 40 across her career. She became the first German woman to fly a helicopter. She became one of the very first humans, of any gender, to fly a rocket-powered aircraft. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, a tiny, screaming wedge of fuel and ambition that killed several of the male test pilots who flew it. Reitsch survived a near-fatal crash in one and went back up. By 1942, she was the first woman in Germany to hold both the Iron Cross Second Class and the Iron Cross First Class. Nazi propaganda fell on her like a gift. Here was the perfect Aryan poster girl, blonde, fearless, brilliant, and visibly, photogenically loyal. The regime printed her photographs everywhere. They used her to argue that German women could be both beautiful and brave, both feminine and committed. That fame came with something nobody else around her ever got. It brought her direct, personal, repeated access to Adolf Hitler. And if you're into the corners of World War II history that don't make the documentaries, hit subscribe. There's a new one every week, because what Hanna Reitsch did with that access is where this story stops being a propaganda fairy tale. On February 28, 1944, while women across Germany were being told that their highest duty was the home, Hanna Reitsch walked into Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden and personally pitched him on suicide pilots. The idea was simple and horrifying. Take German pilots, strap them into modified V-1 flying bombs and Me-328 aircraft, remove the parachutes, and aim them at Allied warships and bomber formations. The pilot would fly the weapon all the way in. There was no escape mechanism, no recovery plan, no second mission. Each man would die on impact. Reitsch believed in it completely. She had personally test-flown a piloted version of the V-1, demonstrating the concept herself before she ever brought it to the Führer. She framed it to Hitler as a final act of devotion. Pilots so loyal to the Reich that they would trade their lives for guaranteed hits. He listened, and although he didn't immediately approve it, he didn't dismiss it either. He passed it to the Luftwaffe to evaluate. Recruiting began almost immediately. Around 70 men eventually signed the suicide pledges that fed into what later became known, loosely, as the Leonidas Squadron, a Luftwaffe formation linked to the broader concept Reitsch had championed. The pilots wrote letters home. They pre-recorded their final messages. Some of them were genuinely true believers. Others were desperate young men who saw no other way to feel useful as the Reich collapsed around them. The program never reached the scale Reitsch wanted. It died not on moral grounds, but on technical and strategic ones. By 1944, Germany no longer had the air superiority needed to even get suicide pilots close to their targets. A handful of missions were eventually flown in the war's final weeks against Soviet bridges, with limited effect. This is the part of her story that most people skip. It is much easier to remember Hanna Reitsch as the brave little aviator who flew into Berlin than as the woman who stood in a mountain villa and convinced a dictator to send 70 young men to certain death. She was not a passive enabler. She was an architect. She wanted the program to be bigger and more ambitious than it ever became. A year after the pitch, she would put her own life into exactly that gear. By late April 1945, there was nowhere left to fly except down. The Soviets were closing on Berlin from three sides. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Hitler was in his concrete bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, holding what was left of the regime together by force of paranoia. And he summoned Field Marshal Robert Ritter von Greim to the bunker for a face-to-face meeting. Hanna Reitsch flew him there. On April 26th, the two of them lifted off from Rechlin Airfield in a tiny Fieseler Storch, a slow, fragile reconnaissance aircraft, the kind of plane you would never choose to fly through the airspace over a besieged capital. Soviet anti-aircraft fire found them almost immediately. Greim was hit in the foot. Reitsch took the controls and brought the plane down on a makeshift strip in the Tiergarten, the Central Park, now a wasteland of burning vehicles, broken trees, and shell craters. She walked Greim through the streets to the bunker entrance while Berlin burned around them. She spent several days inside the Führer bunker. She watched Hitler, a shaking, half-medicated man, sign off on the dismissal of Hermann Göring for treason. She watched him appoint Greim the new chief of the Luftwaffe, a job that no longer commanded anything. She watched the staff prepare for collective suicide, with cyanide capsules distributed like favours at a wedding. According to her own later testimony to American interrogators, she begged Hitler to let her stay and die there with him. He refused, telling her she had to fly Grime out, that the new Luftwaffe chief was needed alive. So on April 30th, the same day Hitler killed himself, Hanna Reitsch took off from a battered street near the Brandenburg Gate, threading anti-aircraft fire and rubble in what was effectively the last German warplane to leave Berlin. In her flight gear, she carried letters from Eva Braun to her sister Gretel. She made it out, but Hitler did not, and for the rest of her life, she would describe those days in the bunker not as a horror she had survived, but as a privilege she had been granted. The bunker is not where her story ends, and what she did afterward is what makes her the actual opposite of every female Nazi. The Americans captured her in May 1945 and held her for roughly 15 months. Their interrogators interviewed her exhaustively. Her account of Hitler's final days became one of the foundational eyewitness sources for everything historians would later write about the bunker. American officers judged her testimony, in their own words, probably the best single eyewitness narrative they had on the subject. But they also noted something that disturbed them. She was not crushed, not ashamed, not playing the "I was just a wife" card that other Nazi women were running through their interrogations down the corridor. She told the Americans, calmly, that she would do all of it again. She held that line for the rest of her life. In late-life interviews, when journalists came hoping for the standard German performance of regret, Reitsch refused to give it. She said on the record that she was not ashamed she had believed in National Socialism. She said she still wore the Iron Cross with diamonds Hitler had personally given her, and she meant it literally. She wore it openly, and photographs from her later years show it pinned to her flight jacket. She had opinions about modern Germany too, and she shared them freely. Post-war Germany, she said, had become a nation of bankers and car makers, a country where soldiers wore beards and questioned their orders. It disgusted her. The only real guilt the German people shared, she insisted, was that they had lost. Think about the contrast for a moment. While Eva Braun's family vanished into a small Munich apartment and refused for the rest of their lives to give a single interview. While Margaret Himmler lived under a false name and pretended not to be herself. While the wives of camp guards wept on the witness stand and swore they had never known what their husbands actually did. While the entire German post-war consensus was being built on shame and quiet, Hanna Reitsch sat in front of cameras, wearing a decoration personally awarded by Adolf Hitler, and told reporters that the war had been worth fighting, and her only complaint was the outcome. She was not pretending, and she was not strategizing. She believed every word. The denazification system had a problem with her, and nobody quite knew how to solve it. She had been Hitler's favourite female pilot. She had personally lobbied him to deploy suicide squadrons. She had been a bunker insider in the regime's last days. She had carried Eva Braun's correspondence out of Berlin in the final hours of the Reich. By any reasonable measure, she was one of the most operationally embedded women in Nazi Germany. But there was one thing she had never done. She had never formally joined the NSDAP. She had never signed a party membership card under the denazification framework the Allies had built, a framework that depended heavily on who had been a card-carrying member of which Nazi organisation. That one technicality mattered enormously. The classification system ran from major offenders at the top, through offenders, lesser offenders, and followers, all the way down to the lightest category in the entire system, reserved for those judged uninvolved with the regime. Entlastet in German, not affected in English. In 1947, after roughly 15 months in American custody, Hanna Reitsch was officially classified as not affected. the Iron Cross with diamonds, the Berchtesgaden pitch, the bunker. None of it was enough to override the absence of a party card. So while ordinary German typists and clerks who had once filled out NSDAP paperwork served prison time and lost their pensions, the woman who had advocated for kamikaze missions walked free. The loophole that let her out is the legal foundation on which the rest of her life was built. Without it, none of what came next would have been possible. She went to places that, on paper, should never have welcomed her. In the late 1950s, Reitsch was advising the Indian government on aviation matters. She befriended Indira Gandhi, who would later become Prime Minister, and met Jawaharlal Nehru, the architect of post-colonial anti-imperial India. These were leaders explicitly aligned against everything fascism had stood for. They knew who she had been. They invited her anyway, because she was a brilliant aviator, and India was a country trying to build a flight culture from almost nothing. Then, between 1962 and 1966, she did something even more striking. She moved to Accra, Ghana, and ran the country's national gliding school. She had been personally invited by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana, a Pan-African socialist, a leader of the global movement against colonialism and racial hierarchy. Nkrumah's Ghana was supposed to be the moral counterweight to everything the Third Reich had stood for, and he hired Hanna Reitsch to train his pilots. Contemporaries in Accra remembered two things about her. The first was that she was an exceptional flight instructor, patient, technically meticulous, demanding the same standards from her African students that she had once demanded of herself. The second was that she still, on occasion, wore the Iron Cross in Accra, while teaching the children of a nation built on the rejection of European racial supremacy. Nobody in Ghana seemed to know quite what to do with that, because the arrangement worked. She could teach, the school needed a teacher, and the political contradiction got quietly set to one side. It is the strangest chapter of her life, and the one that says the most about how the post-war world actually handled Nazis. Not with the moral clarity we like to imagine in retrospect, but with shrugs, with pragmatism, with the willingness to use a good pilot regardless of what she had done to earn that ability. To really feel how chosen any of this was, you have to know she had a near twin. Melita von Stauffenberg was Hanna Reitsch's exact contemporary. Same generation, same Luftwaffe, same celebrated female test pilot status, same Iron Cross. She had every advantage Reitsch had, in nearly identical proportions, working from inside nearly the same offices. Melita used her access differently. She was the sister-in-law of Klaus von Stauffenberg, the colonel who came closest to assassinating Hitler in the July 1944 plot. Melita used her aviator celebrity, her contacts, and her freedom of movement to shield her resistance-connected family. After the plot failed and Klaus was executed, the Gestapo arrested most of the Stauffenberg family and sent them to concentration camps. Melita spent the final months of the war flying repeatedly to those camps to bring them food, news, and whatever protection her name could buy. She died in April 1945, shot down by an American fighter while flying yet another mission to reach her imprisoned in-laws. Same job, same training, same opportunities, same regime, opposite choice. This is the part of the story that matters most for the title's promise. Hanna Reitsch is not the opposite of every female Nazi because circumstance shoved her there. She is the opposite because holding the same cards Melita von Stauffenberg held, she chose differently. She had every chance to use her access the way Melita did, and she didn't take it. She used that access instead to advocate for suicide missions and to carry Eva Braun's letters. The Unrepentance was not an accident of personality. It was a series of decisions, made over and over, by a woman who could see clearly what the alternative looked like. When Hanna Reitsch died in Frankfurt am Main on August 24, 1979, she was 67 years old. The cause was a heart attack. Earlier that same year, she had set her final gliding record in the United States, the country whose interrogators had once held her for 15 months. She left behind something rarer than an unrepentant Nazi. She left behind an unrepentant Nazi who everyone in the end had let off the hook. When we picture the female face of the Third Reich, we picture something specific. We picture Ava Braun in her home movies, smiling vacantly. We picture Magda Goebbels poisoning her own children in the bunker. We picture Margaret Himmler in widow's clothes, denying everything. We picture passivity, ignorance, regret. Sometimes performed, sometimes real, almost always quiet. Hanna Reitsch was the photographic negative of all of that. She was visible where they were hidden. She was active where they were passive. She was proud where they were ashamed. And she was free where, by any reasonable accounting of what she had done, she should have been condemned. She wasn't the opposite of every female Nazi because she escaped them. She was the opposite because all the way to the grave, she refused to take a single piece of it back. Thanks for watching History Hangover. If you found this video insightful, check out our other deep dives into the hidden aftermath of World War II. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.